respect?
Well, no, that's a great question, and actually, I think what I'm encouraged about all of this is that there is now finally a focus on human rights. Even in my country, Canada, we introduced a new privacy legislation. It did not have a human rights basis to it, and I think a lot of people have criticized Canada for that. There was a recognized need that our privacy legislation was out of date, need to be updated, but where was the human rights focus? So I think what I'm encouraged about is there is more of a focus on human rights, but I also think there's still a road ahead to make sure it's firmly entrenched. And it really, personal data is a classic example where there's a debate over whether I as an individual should have, control over my data versus which, puts it, frames it around my ability to control, data which is being sucked in, in so many different ways and virtually impossible for me to keep track of it all versus there's a human rights focus that is with me no matter what I am doing. And hopefully we'll see that discussion move forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I think this is the perfect transition to move to Thea now, who is joining us as the director on the responsible technology team at Omidyar Network. And she brings 18 years of experience to the firm as a development practitioner in inclusive economies, and she leads the policy advocacy and investments that support digital forms of identification, including privacy, user value control, and security. And, one of the discussions about, I think, kind of what you're indicating, it's interesting to hear that Canada, didn't have a human rights framework, given that, you would think that a government like Canada would forefront that. Another thing we hear about kind of in the discussion around human rights and technologies is responsible tech, that it can't just be about the user, right? It also needs to be about the technology itself and the companies and organizations that are developing technology, taking that on so that it is responsible. So I want to turn to Thea and first of all, tell us, what is responsible tech, and what are you seeing in terms of the trends, the new opportunities, and the risks over the past year with respect to some of the questions we laid out at the outset? Thea?
Sure. Thank you so much. And apologies, I can't be on video, and I'm also speaking with a mask on. So apologies if it's muddled. So thank you for the invitation. I look forward to learning from the other panelists as well. So as you mentioned, I sit on the responsible tech team. And the way we look at responsible tech is that there needs to be much stronger guardrails around technologies, whether that's ethical, legal, or institutional, so that those who wield that power and technology, that corporations and governments, are subject to meaningful checks and balances. So a lot of the way that we do that, we have several focus areas. So one is around curbing monopolies, especially around big tech here in the US, but globally. We're also doing quite a bit of work now, which is becoming more important every single day, about working to ensure that encrypted messaging is safe and inclusive and doesn't sacrifice encryption and privacy. And for that one, there's actually a huge requirement for upholding human rights. Other areas where we're starting to get in more is just issues around data colonialism, issues around data extraction that offers more value to governments or to tech companies versus individuals or communities, but also who's designing the tech. So many of these tech decisions, especially in governments, are being designed by people, older folks, but they're not actually including young populations. We work a lot with next generation futurists around a lot of these issues. But where I spend a lot of my time is around accountability and transparency and digital ID systems. So I thought I'd go through a little bit of that and some of the challenges that we're seeing, but then in the next section, we'll talk a bit more about the opportunities. And they're critical. The ID space is so critical to COVID because, there was already a huge call, but because of COVID, just a mass increase for digitizing government services. Even here in the US, just 2 months ago, there was a hearing in front of the Congress around AI, privacy, and identification. So it really is a global issue. And it matters because a lot of these systems are rolling out so fast with untested technology, or quite honestly, out-of-date technology, even though they're required, for example, for social welfare benefits or for health benefits. The other reason it's so critical is that we're also seeing an increase in some of these systems designed to be used for national security versus for service delivery. And another is, there are a lot of, everywhere around the world, there are a lot of short-term policies around data collection required under COVID for health reasons, and some of them are justifiable, but the concern that we have and are seeing is that some of these short-term policies are becoming long-term and made permanent without any of the transparent processes. So just quickly, I'll walk through some of the 5 areas where we see challenges that need to be corrected for a lot of these systems to actually be, we would consider to be responsible. So one is this often with governments, what constitutes an ID, or especially a digital ID. Some have centralized databases, some don't, some is a barcode, some just have a magnetic strip, a smart card, and increasingly, again, very much linked to human rights, is the linked to a SIM card. So it takes away a lot of privacy often. Another issue is we see a lot of mission creep. So an ID could be introduced for one specific purpose, but then it starts being required for others. And again, we're seeing that a lot, especially with people being able to access cash transfers, social welfare benefits, and health services. And I would say this for marginalized populations, but I would say a lot of those are more systemically excluded populations than just calling them marginalized. We've done a lot of work, for example, in Uganda, a lot of our partners, and they're finding especially for older populations, are being completely excluded from some of these digital IDs and technologies needed to support it. And also just very much limited transparency and accountability in the design of these systems. And just quite honestly, there's such a mismatch of power. The issuers hold all the power, the governments, the vendors. And so, and also just a lot of them are designed, we're seeing more and more that really can't operate in an offline setting. So that, again, that's further exclusion at the registration or the other stages. And the other thing we're seeing, because I know I'm running out of time, it's just their poor design. They're not designed with a human rights focus or even a justice focus beyond sometimes to have privacy, but not even usually with privacy. And within that, they're often designed to be discriminatory in the sense of singling out a specific ethnic group or specific religious group or even specific individual sexual orientation. And the other thing, which again, I know has been in the news quite a bit, is that they're designed primarily or at least secondarily for surveillance purposes, going back to the national security issues. So, and also some of that data is then being sold on to commercial third parties. And then again, I think just echoing the other speaker as well, a lot of these are happening without proper legal safeguards. So we talk a lot about data protection, which is critical, but also consumer protection and, for example, competition laws as well, especially linked to some of the larger tech players. So there's a quick challenges. And in the next section, I could definitely talk about some ways to move forward, especially with the broader responsible tech focus.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Thea. Before I let you off the hook, though, you
Sure.
mentioned some pretty important terms that I want to make sure, we just hear a little bit more about, because, this is a global forum. And you mentioned, for example, data colonialism and data extraction. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that means and why those are two very, I think, relevant issues and terms to this broader discussion around economic development, social inclusion, and human rights?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, I'll just use governments as an example, are collecting data on individuals. But there's also quite a bit of, one, how is that data actually being used? By the government, how long is it being held? Who's collecting it? All of these different issues. But we're also seeing quite a bit more is then that data is on-sold to commercial third parties. Even an example right now, and there's a number of laws that are happening, especially at some places in East Africa, where, for example, a lot of the data that's potentially being linked to your national ID, which is digital, could also be potentially sold on to other vendors, like for financial services. So basically you're losing, not only are you losing control of data, you don't even know how your data is being used and how long it's being stored. So that's the concern there. I mean, even here in the US, there's a lot of that we call data brokers. So they're taking the data and they're on selling it to third parties.
Great. Thank you very much. And I do want to acknowledge I'm keeping track of the chat, but I am going to try to get through our first round with the panelists. And with that, I'd like to now move on to Amalia from Wikimedia. And first, can you just make sure, so we're all starting from the same point. What is the Wikimedia Foundation? And could you talk about what you're seeing from your perspective about the trends, opportunities, and risks over the past year, and kind of how Wikimedia is thinking about this? Please, Amalia.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Just to clarify, I did have the title of a policy fellow until September this year. Now I'm the lead public policy specialist for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so just to make clear that, and then the second, I'm very happy to be here to join this conversation and the opportunity to talk to you. The Wikimedia Foundation is a nonprofit that hosts and promotes Wikipedia and other related projects. The organization, the foundation operates the servers for the projects and support a global movement of thousands of people that volunteer their time to contribute to free knowledge. That's who we are. A summary of who we are. As an organization dedicated to providing free knowledge for everyone, we know all too well how the pandemic has made people have a greater need to find reliable information about COVID-19, and our community has been working very, very hard to make that information available and in a neutral and reliable way. But we also know that there are many other factors that cause that group of people that lack access to the internet or reliable information are suffering this because of system of powers of and oppressions, no? And I would specifically would like to address the question about trying to understand the growing importance of inclusion and human rights in the societal debate and public awareness, no? And then very quickly, I will jump to the risks that we see that come from the pandemic that emerged since the pandemic, no? So in a sense, we should recognize that data technology have served over the years for the political action of many grassroots social movements who has limited means to make their voices heard. That is to say, that is indisputable that digital technology have played a role in helping to make visible and amplify the work of a wide range of social movements seeking social justice, racial justice, gender justice, among others. In other words, the barriers to access to information has been somehow reduced, and with it, awareness of inclusion and human rights has increased. And I'm sure that knowledge platform like Wikipedia, one of our projects, have played a crucial role in bringing together and making available essential information so that people can know and uphold their human rights. The best of all is our content, the content that you can find in the Wikipedia is sustained by ordinary people. Some of them are scientific, some of them are students, some of them are just people interested in specific topics who what joins them is that they see the project as a source of information, and that's why they actively contribute by generating accurate, reliable, and diverse knowledge, which means that the Wikipedia community can decide for themselves within some policies that the project has and the community agree on, what content they want to focus their time and energy on, and what information is relevant to their community and their context. But because we believe in the power of knowledge sharing. We know that social, cultural, financial, political, and legal conditions must exist to protect the right of citizens to build and participate in online community that share knowledge and collaborate for the common good, such as the Wikipedia. Actually, I see that Andre mentioned the work of the, what you say specifically, Wikipedia has been recognized as a public common good because of all that I have mentioned already. But, we see the impact of the economic, political, and legal barriers that are preventing people from accessing and contributing to free knowledge. First, if we want to talk to economic gaps, we see this within societies, but between countries, and this is growing. And here we see how disparities in meaningful access to the internet play a role on some of the risks that we can see today. In these days, this coupled with the cost of connectivity and the cost of equipment to connect to the internet, and also lack of digital skills. We also see systems of oppression based on privilege and power are also increasingly exert pressure on populations in situations of more vulnerability, on those that challenge the status quo. No? It is unquestionable for us that this is connected with the violence faced by certain groups of people, such women, people who identify with sexual orientation or gender identities other than the heteronormative, with against racial people, human rights defenders, social leaders, journalists, women journalists more specifically, and so on and so forth, who, because of this violence, they are forced to silence themselves. They are forced to not participate in the public debate that occurs through digital technology. In addition, we see that often they are pursuing legitimate aims to make the internet a better and a safer space. Regulatory initiative is also another risk that we're seeing, of that those initiatives that often has unintended effect of increasing internet censorship, including limiting legitimate and legal online speech, and creating surveillance system which endanger people's right to freedom of expression, association, access to knowledge, and privacy. And you can keep mentioning rights that are affected by this regulation. And the risks are many, but the opportunities are also massive. And the Wikimedia Foundation, we believe that our projects are actually excellent examples of how people can organize and work together for the common good of society. But for this to happen, it is necessary that the rights and the safety conditions are in place for the people to collaborate and work together on those things that are of their interest. So yeah, I wanted to extend myself, but I can, for the next block, discuss a little bit more of opportunity, what we are doing, what we think can be done.
Great. Thank you very much, Amalia. I really appreciate that. I think very interesting to hear that, obviously the importance of reliable, accurate, and timely information during COVID, but also, kind of accessible and free information. And also that you're feeling that the barriers to the access to information has been reduced, awareness of human rights increased. But I think that everyone would probably agree that despite the awareness, it is the challenge of translating awareness into enjoyment. And that, of course, there remains a lot to be done in terms of barriers. So we are definitely going to get back into this conversation. And I would just point out also, Amalia participated along with us in an IGF parliamentary track pre-session, which has happened last week as part of the process to feed into the Internet Governance Forum's main session this year. And it was interesting to hear from, Wikimedia and Facebook on the same panel about really different approaches to governing massive populations of users and who are, of course, citizens and people. So also thinking about the terminology we use. But before we get into that, let us move to our final kind of panelist for her thoughts on some of these key questions about, how are human rights and digital inclusion, societal debates around these issues influenced by the pandemic, about the new opportunities, offered for digital technologies and the internet for positive change. Alex is the global policy lead for human rights and free expression at Google. And so she is responsible for coordinating and driving the company-wide human rights strategy using approaches grounded in business and human rights. And so, Alex, I'd ask you to focus here in your initial comments on the kind of the trends, the opportunities, and the risks, and then we'll get into the discussion around governance models and also bring in some of the questions from the chat. Alex, please go ahead.
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks for including Google in the conversation today. It's great to hear all of the topics folks are raising, because I think those are all topics that are top of mind at the company today in terms of the, as you said, sort of the challenges that we see and some of the opportunities that there are going forward. So let me just maybe back up a little bit and talk about how Google is thinking about these issues writ large. And I think it's probably similar at many of the other large companies, at least. And that is that we have long been sort of dedicated to and had values around freedom of expression and privacy. And that has permeated the ways the company thinks about how we engage in public policy conversations around the governance of the internet and the governance of and regulation of our services. And it also impacts how we build the tools that we do, the features that we consider, the policies that we create to say what is and is not allowed on our services. All of those things, all of those sort of factors play together in terms of how we think about how human rights operates on the internet, and in particular, what it looks like for us as a company to consider our responsibility to respect rights. And so in terms of trends, I think what we see is that many of the larger companies are taking seriously their obligations related to human rights in the digital space, and doing that in a framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Many of those companies are companies that are also members of the Global Network Initiative, and it's a strength of companies that do participate, and it's an opportunity for companies that don't to really reinforce the need for multi-stakeholder engagement. But other trends that we see, so there's sort of what companies are doing, and I think we do see many companies stepping up, but there is a lot of room for improvement across areas that touch freedom of expression and privacy and non-discrimination and various other rights that are sort of salient for many companies. At the same time, we also see a significant increase in regulations. And so that's true for content governance, it's true for data governance, and it's also, we see increases in sort of government conversations around AI regulation as well. And so in all of those settings, those are opportunities for us to have a conversation with governments, companies, civil society, academics, and others about how do we want these services to look? What do we want responsibility to look like on behalf of companies? And what do we see as the role of government in doing that, for everyone to do that in a rights respecting way? And so as all of these kind of legislative conversations get teed up, each of those is an opportunity for us to really sort of influence what the models are. And as we've seen, the models that get picked up in one country oftentimes are inspiration for what get used elsewhere. Sometimes that's done in a way that's helpful, and sometimes it makes it more difficult for, at least for companies, to manage respecting the rights of their users. So at least that's what I would say in terms of how companies are behaving and trends related to that. And then also the ways we are seeing regulation impact how companies and all stakeholders are sort of working together or not related to regulation. And in each of that, the more we sort of are able to work together, those of us that have common commitments related to human rights, related to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and with a commitment to free and open internet, there's sort of an opportunity for all of us as stakeholders to drive improvement in a way that continues to be more rights respecting, because I think the sort of threat, if we're swatting the conversation, is that if we don't, we risk ceding the conversation to those who might be less interested in free and open internet, might be less interested in protecting freedom of expression, even for unpopular opinions, and or privacy, even for dissidents. So that's sort of what's at stake, at least for how we're looking at it as well. So I'll stop there, Courtney, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, before I let you off the hook, Alex, could you just talk a little bit about how has the pandemic influenced some of this thinking and some of the issues that the companies are grappling with? And, you know, the previous speakers mentioned, for example, Thea was discussing, you know, digital IDs and some of the products that were kind of rolled out by governments and companies to, realistically address the problems with the pandemic, but at the same time, that many of those lack the privacy guarantees, the protections, the regulations needed to ensure that they were not, misused. And so that gets to issues of trust, which Bob raised. So talk to us a little bit about the pandemic and how that's influenced thinking about this.
Yeah. I mean, so in the first instance, of course, we've seen people like kind of rely on online access in ways that are exponentially greater than they were before, at least in many places around the world. And that sort of created opportunities for us to think about, in particular related to COVID, like how do we help the world get out of this problem? So one of the things that Google did was partner with Apple and create the exposure notifications platform. And that's an example of where it's incumbent, like sort of there are interests from government and companies and civil society for all of those stakeholders to work together to help create solutions related to public health. At the same time, in doing that, sort of respecting those human rights, all of us have to focus on how do we protect privacy and freedom of expression and non-discrimination in the context of that. And so that was an example of how we spent a lot of time as a company consulting with stakeholders around what types of policies we should have related to exposure notifications, what features we could create in products to ensure that we were protecting the rights of users for any government that was creating an exposure notifications app. So I think that's, anyway, just kind of in the context of COVID-19, that's an example of what it can look like when companies take the initiative to say, we want to do something that's going to help, and we demand that we do that in a way that is privacy protective and rights respecting. That sort of led us to a platform that was maybe, I think, not as exciting as several stakeholders wanted it to be. I think there were definitely stakeholders that wanted us to have a platform that captured more information, that allowed more information sharing of private information. And we landed where we did because of the rights balancing that we were doing. So I think that's an example of kind of how all of the conversation between stakeholders, multilaterals, governments, companies, civil society leads us to kind of products that can assist us in the best way possible and maximizing for being rights respecting. But certainly we've seen kind of a lot of data flying around in the context of COVID, and it really is incumbent upon the companies that are creating tools to help facilitate solutions, but ensure that they're doing that in a rights respecting way.
Thank you, Alex. Before we move on to the second ban, which is thinking about possible governance strategies to promote inclusion and human rights, including the IGF. And also I'm going to want to bring in Yik Chan's question about kind of the best governance model to respond to such technological uncertainty and knowledge divide, with her kind of intervention that she feels like perhaps multi-stakeholderism is insufficient. Before we go on to that, though, I want to bring in Henriette's question, our fearless leader of the MAG, because I think it's very relevant to the discussion that we've been having around, she's asking here, whenever people talk about human rights in the internet, the conversation focuses on civil and political rights. Why overlook economic and social and cultural rights? Not all countries are signatories to the treaty, but these are very significant rights to promote and respect, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So I think that's an interesting point, and I would love to just like do a quick rapid response from our panelists, and kind of we'll go in the same order that we initially went, and just your kind of thoughts on that, and how you feel that does or doesn't kind of work into the approach that your institution is taking. So Bob, can I ask you to briefly respond to that first?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and in fact, I think in answering it, I'm going to put in a plug for another UN body called UNCTAD. And so UNCTAD in late September released what they call their digital economy report, which I would highly encourage everyone to read. And it's called "For Whom the Data Flow," which is a very catchy title. But it talks about how developing countries are essentially left out of any conversation around governance of data. And it has social implications, it has economic implications. And to go to the point about multi-stakeholder, fully agree, we need a multi-stakeholder approach, which I'll discuss in a minute, but multi-stakeholder doesn't imply representative. And I think you need a multi-stakeholder and representative approach. I'm an economist, so I'll speak as an economist. What we have are like classic insider-outsider dynamics at play. So you have the insiders, which are some developed countries, some firms, essentially defining the governance for everybody. And not surprisingly, they don't necessarily take into account the needs or the impacts on countries outside of those discussions.
Great, thank you, Bob. Okay, Thea, over to you. Thoughts on Henriette's kind of framing of that question. Okay, I'm not hearing from Thea, so let me go on to Amalia.
Well, I think it's a great question, and we at the Wikimedia Foundation are internally, we are thinking how to make our policy positions more clear, that we do not only support civil or political rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights. But it's at the end of the day, our projects are also a good example of how those rights are protected, or the realization of this right now, when our projects are used to preserve culture, to preserve languages, minority languages, to connect with the cultural institutions and libraries, and how to make sure that collections that are behind door go public and open to people. So our projects are doing a lot on preserving or protecting economic cultural rights, but we know that we can do much better on our policy positions in that regard, because the project is there doing it already, the community is doing it, and we should also embed all these in our positions, in our operation, in our processes.
Thank you, Amalia. And Alex, can I ask you address that to address that both, from Google's perspective, but also the UN guiding principles on human rights? What do they say about this topic?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the second half, which is that from the UNGP's perspective, all of those rights are relevant, and all of those would be considered by companies. But the UNGPs are also, they sort of counsel companies to focus on the salience that are the rights that are most salient to their business. And so that means that where your business is touching rights the most is where you should be focusing your human rights due diligence, and being sure that you are identifying and mitigating any potential harm. So it sort of depends in particular on what the company is, what the product is, and actually how in fact it might be touching people's rights. So it's less the focus of whether it's ICCPR, ICSCR, more about what is the product and which rights are it which rights is it touching. Human rights due diligence would take into account all of those, and you would focus on where there is greatest scope severity. and scale. And I would say, it's true, we do in this arena, or sort of in tech broadly, spend most time focusing on civil and political rights, in particular, freedom of expression and privacy. I think partially that is because those are salient rights for most tech companies, or for many of the companies that participate heavily in this space. But it is also true that we spend a lot of time internally, maybe we don't do as much externally, talking about how we are integrating analysis around other social, economic, and cultural rights. All of the work that we did around COVID was related to right to health. And so, in fact, much of the due diligence and the kind of the issues that we were spotting and considering were about right to health, potentially sort of in tension with freedom of expression or privacy, and kind of working to understand how we could maximize right to health and access to information around health, and at the same time ensure that we are allowing people to have opinions as the science is revealing itself and changing, and allowing people to share critical health information as needed in service of the public health, while also protecting them individually. So I would say it really, for us, that really was a conversation about all of the rights that were at stake.
Thanks, Alex, for that response. I think I'm not sure if Thea is still able to join in or not, but something that she was mentioning, which I would just put into conversation with what you raised, because talking about like the product or the service does not necessarily address the fundamental kind of like business design of these platforms and these other issues around kind of data governance and data flows and who those belong to and how those are used. And so I think that would also be interesting to hear about. Actually, maybe I'll just ask you to respond really quickly. You were talking about the COVID tracking apps and wanting to be rights respecting in the type of data that was, collected. But at the same time, there's the potential to learn things from those data flows that would be really helpful to public health authorities. Could you just address briefly how, if at all, that played in and how you guys addressed that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a core part of our conversation that we had as we developed various tools that we created around COVID-19. So I talked about exposure notifications. We also produced something called community mobility reports, which we created after conversations with public health officials. So they said that they were interested. This was sort of early in the COVID days, where we were all just learning about sort of how it was spread and what trends were and how people were moving, and were people staying home. And so community mobility reports is really created to help the public and public health officials in particular understand where people traffic was, so that we could be careful not to congregate, et cetera. But that sort of product evolved as a result of conversations with public health officials. And so it's certainly true that we are in conversation with experts around what might be needed to facilitate kind of the most important aspects from the health perspective, while also, I think, from the company's perspective, there's probably even more expertise related to privacy and freedom of expression internally. But we do have a large health vertical and have a chief health officer who I think facilitated a lot of our internal conversations from the health perspective as well to help us get to a balance. But it does underscore that really you do need experts from all of the relevant areas to help you identify what exactly is needed, what's the problem you're trying to solve, and how do you get there in a way that is rights respecting and potentially advancing if possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's Thea, are you
I am
on?
here, yeah.
Great,
Sorry about that.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to echo. I mean, what a lot of the other three panelists have said. It's obviously some of this, when new tech is introduced, thinking around data protection and privacy, what we see so often globally, again, is that a lot of, data protection, even sometimes consumer law, is just cut and paste, from other countries. So it's just not even useful or applicable. So I think that's critical. But, going back to what I was talking about, especially around some of these IDs or use of different technologies, at minimum, there should be a human rights assessment built into even the consideration for introducing these technologies. But I think, building on that as well, is that something we're trying to fund much more is just how do we invest much more in moving things out of English only or Spanish only or French only into multiple languages, especially around different technologies. And also, just recognizing that, introduction of different types of technologies or how the technology is used, can shift or even increase, racism, economic inequality, and gender bias. And so how do we make sure that any type of technology is used to reduce or certainly isn't used to increase? And other areas that we're really focusing on as well is just, again, thinking around, there's such an increase around technology, thinking around addiction and misinformation and manipulation. What needs to be in place? What types of digital policies or even taxes need to be in place to actually to balance out some of those harms as well?
Thank you, Thea. Obviously, this is a very rich discussion, and it sounds to me like a lot of the times, despite the seeming focus on human rights being kind of conceptualized as political and civil rights, in fact, when we get down into the work that's being done and the concepts that are being thought about, it does include a broader array of the social, economic, and cultural issues, Henriette, that you mentioned. I think maybe there is some sort of kind of separation here between how we rhetorically discuss these things and human rights as a covering term versus what we actually mean about this in practice, which I think is heartening to see that we are having a broader conceptualization of human rights, although it does seem, in my opinion, I'll bring in here as my prerogative as the moderator to kind of provide some analysis, which is that so much of the debate up into the pandemic and also during the pandemic and the accompanying infodemic has focused on content moderation and content regulation, which is, I think, a lot of times really about freedom of expression and privacy. Whereas I think that the pandemic has also made it clear that, in fact, it's about much more. And not only, Alex, you mentioned who is consulted, but how do you think about who needs to be consulted based on your conceptualization of the issue and how you're going to govern that, whether this is a health issue or it's an information issue or it's an economic issue. And in fact, I think what we're hearing, from this discussion is they are all of these. And so we need this kind of polycentric approach to governing with a lot of different voices and stakeholders both taking part, but also recognizing the limits of that given the power dynamics in the global system and, of course, replicated within the internet governance system. So with that, I want to segue into our second kind of focus of this conversation, which is looking at possible governance strategies to promote inclusion in human rights, including the role of the Internet Governance Forum. And so I'm going to go back to the panelists in the order that we started and ask you to talk about some of these possible governance strategies. And I'd also like you to address the question raised by Yik Chan, who is also a fellow colleague of mine from the steering committee of GigaNet, which is the academic network of GigaNet scholars, who asks about, what is the best governance model to respond to this technological uncertainty and divide, which is, I think, getting to the first part of the question, but her, assertion that multi-stakeholderism is not efficient or sufficient rather. So if you could kind of address again, what kind of governance strategies to promote inclusion in human rights and address this question around multi-stakeholderism. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm looking at Yik Chan's comment, which said she was waiting for me to introduce the word polycentric model. So glad I could make that happen. All right, Bob, starting with you.
Yeah, no, I have to say polycentric, I think it's the first time I've heard that word. So, but I think the way I characterize it, maybe it's the same or maybe it isn't. I call it horizontal governance as opposed to vertical. And I'll get into that in a sec. But, I think just picking up, where we've left off in the earlier discussion, my argument is going to be that we really need to continue to invest in governance. Because what we've seen is a lack of governance, is fueling digital divides and undermining, inclusiveness, social values, and of course, we've even seen it undermining democracy. So, I take the point, I think it was Thea that made it, like, you can't just cut and paste. And there is this temptation out there just to cut and paste to what's going on, around the world. And I think GDPR is the best example of that, where countries are saying, well, we're kind of subject to it, so why not just adopt it? And I think that's a very problematic strategy, but it's maybe not a surprising strategy if you don't really, if you can't effectively participate in governance discussions. So I have a few points. So they're very, very high level. There's further detail on our website, and they're going to seem really obvious, yet I guess I can say, at least from my organization's perspective, these discussions really aren't happening, at least as systematically as we like. So the first is, when we talk about governance of data and AI and social media platforms, it's not just do governance in each of these areas where governance is needed. They have to be thought of together. Because governance decisions in one area, for example, related to data, have implications downstream or upstream, depending on how you look at this. Yet that's not typically the way that the discussions take place. And I think bias around data is a classic one, where I'm an economist. I don't know if there's bias in data or in not understanding the data and how it's being used. But anyway, it's one of those examples. Another one is, we do have to improve our governance tools, and we have to be flexible in their use too. So to pick up the point that was raised, I don't think there's one solution here. It's a combination of things that are going to have to be used, and they will depend on national or even local circumstances. But, the governance tools, there's standards, there's principles, there's regulations, there's laws. They all have to be used, and we just got to figure out when to use them. And at the same time, we have to think about what is that governance model? Is it self-regulation, co-regulation, government regulation? And we have to update, some of the tools we use. Regulatory sandboxes are something that's been used very effectively in financial regulatory reforms. I think the UK has talked about e-sandboxes. There's ways to experiment, from which we can all learn.
Sorry, can you just explain the sandbox? I think that's probably a term that a lot of us are not necessarily familiar with.
So essentially what it does is allows a company to experiment in an environment where you kind of suspend some of the rules that they would be subject to if this technology were unleashed, so to speak. And so through the sandbox, it's just a way to experiment. Okay, here's a set of regulations that we would like to put in place, but we don't know if we really understand the implications of those regulations. So let's set up the sandbox and allow a company or whatever to operate within it, and then we'll see if it's suitable to scale. And as I said, it has been used very effectively in financial regulatory reform. Now, to go back to something I think I've already raised, governance has to be inclusive, and I'm going to use three words. It has to be systemic, it has to be multi-stakeholder, and it has to be representative. And systemic, this is, for example, the role of civil society. Civil society is brought into governance discussions almost when either they force their way into the conversation or, let's reach out to them, as opposed to systematically having discussions with civil society as you're drafting a regulation or drafting legislation. But the point where, where we're doing a lot of work in my organization is this coordination at the international level. And, we've heard, from Google and Facebook, we need this international coordination. And I mean, some people can be cynical and say it's self-serving, but I also think it really is important that we need global coordination. But the question is how to do that. And so one of the things we've done at CG, it's on a smaller scale, is we've created what we call a global platform governance network. And it brings together civil servants, regulators, legislative staff, international organizations from all regions of all regions of the world and many different countries to share ideas that they're facing on governance issues related to platforms. And we'll soon release a report on transparency that's come out of those discussions. That's one thing, a civil society organization could do. And for full disclosure, Reset is help provide funding to that. But let's now turn to this international element, because this, of course, is the IGF, right? This is the Internet Governance Forum. And, I would say, IGF already plays this very valuable role. It's like the breadth of discussions and engagement. I mean, it's astounding. It's almost hard to keep track of. And of course, it is multi-stakeholder. But at the same time, you referred to the high-level report on digital cooperation, Courtney. It is an excellent report. I think there's some great ideas in it. And one of the ideas is how to expand the role of the IGF, and there's this IGF plus model. And I think one of the strengths of IGF is this breadth of discussions, but one of the weaknesses is, and I think we kind of touched on it, is getting to decision making, like how to do that. And so, independent of this work at CG, we have been doing work as well, and we proposed something called a Digital Stability Board, which is modeled after the Financial Stability Board, which was created in the heart of the financial crisis to reform financial market or regulation around financial markets. And I draw some parallels between what happened then and why this could be a useful framework for digital cooperation. But at its heart is, getting decisions made. And that's extremely complicated because there's no one approach. There's different values, and those values clash. But I do think there are opportunities to bring these different ideas to the table and lead to concrete outcomes that governments own and will implement. And I'll leave it there because there's a lot that people can read if they'd like. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. I will ask maybe if you don't mind putting a couple of links in the chat after I'm done with you, which is not yet, because there is a question in the chat about recommending mechanisms for data governance in high-risk countries like Sudan and Myanmar. And I would just ask, you mentioned this idea of a digital stability board. Does that extend to countries, as Svetlana Zenz has asked in the chat, those kind of high-risk countries? And I would add, countries like Lebanon, where I spent a lot of time, where there isn't political stability, much less digital stability. Is this concept extendable to kind of all situations, or do you need a stable country before you can have a digital stability board?
Yeah, you know what? I think in hindsight, maybe the name isn't the best name. So the G7 Economic Resilience Panel just said essentially the same thing, and they called it a data and technology board. I think stability throws people off, and it's just because I drew upon the Financial Stability Board model. So no, of course you don't have to be. I mean, in fact, there's many countries out there. How do I put this? Where technology is being used in ways that it wasn't intended, and it's having very real negative societal impacts. And one would want to have discussions, those countries where this is happening, embedded in discussions on governance, because of course they're directly impacted and probably have ideas on how to improve governance at the same time. So this Digital Stability Board model is fully scalable to many different types of countries. And one of its features is to ensure that there is outreach to any country, essentially, because, as state the obvious, we've said it before, the reach of data and the technology is global in nature. So, the discussions have to be global, and there are ways to do it. I think one of the things is like, how do we even get started? Like, how do we get started to make these decisions? Well, it can be done. And as I say, if you can tackle big banks, global banks and insurers, and get them to the table with government and civil society to draw out, global solutions to make the financial system more resilient and stable, one can do it around digital technologies too.
Interesting. I like your optimism, Bob. I will say before I turn to Thea, I think one of the fundamental differences between, say, the financial sector and the internet kind of broad sector writ large is that you had already existing frameworks for governing financial flows and systems prior to the creation of banks or as banks were being created. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the regulatory sandbox, because essentially we have, a lot of the internet and data digital companies created in largely an absence of regulation, although obviously there is some regulation that they benefit from, for example, copyright protections, which, very few people are looking at, saying that doesn't apply. But, I wonder, one thing that occurs to me, we don't have to answer this now, but, regulatory sandbox is part of that sandbox. What happens if we don't regulate? I mean, to some extent, that is the experiment that we're currently experiencing now. We're going to have to leave that debate though for later. I'm going to turn to Thea and ask her to address, some of these possible governance strategies to promote the inclusion of human rights, the role of the IGF, and multi-stakeholderism as a guiding principle. Thea.
Yeah, thanks. I think to a lot of it, what you're saying is that we need to learn a lot more, to be honest with you. So I think that's a lot of what we're trying to also do. But I think, so there are some things we can be focusing on now. Again, kind of going back to what I was saying before, is that reframing, data as property, really thinking more about how do we think about data more for societal benefit and for community benefit. That itself, I think, would be a huge shift. Some of the other ways that we also look at it is just, we recognize that right now, the data economy is very much unequal and it's dominated by a small number of companies. So a lot of what we're also trying to do is make sure that there's more competition and players in the market. But I would say also, that's just not here in the US, that's globally, but also making sure that US tech or European tech also isn't dominating, I would say, globally to a lot of extents. We're making sure that more local actors as well are part of the data economy. I think those are the other ones. Is again, for us, one of the things we're really looking at is that we recognize there needs to be more evidence. I think, going back to what you were just saying around maybe states or countries that are going through conflict, or, there's a lot written, but I don't think necessarily they're always models that can be used in person. They make sense, but what would you actually do to put those into practice? So I think there's a lot more that we need to do about that, especially when you talk about regulations. Often, regulations can, sit for weeks, months, years, and the technology has already moved past it. So what does that need to look like? What potentially could be intermediary stages, or is regulation really the goal? Or it's the goal, but how is it really realistic? And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of places, just because it's moving too slow, or even if it's in place, it's not really relevant anymore. Or, for example, in a lot of places, again, kind of going back to the competition, is that smaller players can't necessarily pay the fines where larger players can. So again, it's also minimizing the number of players in the market. And again, I won't, the civil society and the public participation obviously are critical. But another area I think that leads to stronger data governance as well is around, an area we really support is how do you increase transparency and really how do we invest more in journalism around the state? So all types of journalism. So a lot of what we've done and hoping others will as well is that how do you also bring expertise and more exposure to different types of journalists around existing tech and emerging tech issues. So that's another way they can lead to stronger data governance, and you're actually opening up who understands and can be actually a part of those conversations.
Thank you, Thea, and thanks for mentioning journalists. My background is in journalism and press freedom and journalism and media development are kind of at the core of a lot of the work that I do. And I think this question around governance includes a broader ecosystem that includes, the people the institutions that cover this type of decision making, because that is how it gets out to a wider perspective. But I want to ask you just briefly, Bob mentioned the importance of investing in governance. Omidyar is a funds many projects in this space and organizations that work in this space. How do you think about investing in governance and in enabling organizations, journalists, individuals to participate meaningfully in that governance?
Sure, no, that's a great question. A lot of what we're doing in this space, or at least what I can say what I do a lot in the space, is how do you bring new actors and different organizations in this space? So for example, sometimes there's not a lot of funding, for example, to lawyers groups, so that even some of the legal system can get smarter or more savvy around some of these tech issues. I would say, again, going back to one of the earlier questions as well, is how are we funding groups that may be smaller, but for example, aren't getting funded because they tend to get sub-grants versus the main grant, so they can actually grow organically like they need to and they should. So that's where a lot of where I spend my time, just again, really trying to bring, how can we support new voices to different types of organizations, but also different individuals that maybe wouldn't be part of those discussions. Sometimes when we say civil society, we kind of mean everything. But as we know, even within civil societies, I think most of us come from that space, there's a lot of power differentials within that. So again, it's being much more careful and conscious about who you're speaking with and not just speaking to the obvious players. And sometimes that's taking risk. And so sometimes it's a brand new organization. And again, just going back to what I was mentioning earlier around working more with younger populations, like Gen Z populations. I mean, these data governance decisions are being made about them, but they're not part of the conversation about how they engage with tech, which looks very different than, even someone my age or someone even older. So again, it's really it's taking those approaches more than anything else.
Thank you, Thea. And I mean, to that point, like Gen Z has grown up with essentially their entire life has been digitized and datafied in many parts of the world with no input from them. So let me now move on to Amalia again with the same kind of question around the possible governance strategies that could promote inclusion and human rights, the role of the IGF, and how you think about multi-stakeholderism. Is that sufficient these days?
Thank you, Courtney. It's kind of funny because when I think about our model specifically, it's a community governance model, and it's not perfect, but it has worked. But it also works because our commitment as the foundation, as I said at the beginning, we support this movement, we support this community, and we have some commitments with this community, with this movement, that it make it works. It's been 20 years and we're still here, and it's growing and it's thriving. And those a few of those commitments that are so important for this community governance model that we have. A number of things we have committed to, just a few to name a few. We are strongly committed to defending and protecting the free speech, the privacy and anonymity of our readers and contributors. That's one thing that we have very clear and is embedded in our DNA. We are also fostering knowledge equality so that our community can thrive, can be better, and can be more diverse to drive inclusive governance practices. And in terms of free speech, we are making sure that any content regulation, whether it's our own policies or our governmental policies or regulations, are based on human rights standard. That's the first thing for us in order to make everything work this model. And we also are very committed to ensuring that anyone can access knowledge on equal terms, regardless of their location. So we are opposing any regulation that seeks to divide the internet along national lines. We are putting in place innovative solution to ensure our user right to privacy and anonymity. So we have private practices that reflect that commitment, as we have policies on data minimization. That means that we collect the minimum information necessary for a specific purpose. And we have robust community reviewed privacy policy that include protecting anonymity. And we proud ourselves of hosting and managing knowledge platform that after 20 years have been able to be sustainable without ads and without tracking our readers' browsing habit. About knowledge equality, this is a key priority for us, for our community, but above all for the Wikimedia movement. We recognize the significant gaps in representation and knowledge that exist in our project. So we have a lot to do in this area. So we are working in improving the diversity of contributor and content on Wikimedia project. That also is so important for any internet governance forum to make sure there are diversity there, as we wanted to our community, our movement to be.
Can I just ask you though, because I want to bring it out from just kind of what is Wikimedia doing, but let's talk about like this governance strategy. So taking the Wikimedia model, are you suggesting that this should be or could be a strategy that would promote inclusion and human rights kind of throughout the internet governance system? And, you know, you're talking about a lot about Wikimedia, but to what extent, for example, you're talking about, you know, the community driven. It sounds like it's a little bit of a different model than multi-stakeholder, right? Wikimedia is not explicitly trying to be multi-stakeholder. It is essentially being community driven, which may or may not include a lot of stakeholders, right? So can you kind of get in, like, take a step back from like the specifics of the Wikimedia project for itself and think about what do you learn from this as applicable to a broader governance strategy?
You know, just working always top down is very difficult to make the processes inclusive. So one of the good practices that I think we have in our communities, we work bottom up, and that's something that has to be done. I know it's very difficult in terms of policy and you know, power dynamics within between state and so on, but we need to work not only top down but bottom up with the people that are doing the work, that are bringing the concerns, and I know it's time consuming. It even needs more resources to be done, more time to be done. But it's something that, for my understanding, is that our community is thriving because we are not imposing decisions, but we are working with them to decide what is better for them. And I think that's something that in terms of internet governance processes is important to work on that and to make sure to make every effort to make those spaces more diverse. I've been in civil society for some time now, and it's so difficult for civil society to be there. But at the end, it's so difficult to bring civil society that are fighting many injustices to understand how also internet policy is affecting their work, even though they are not necessarily working on this issue, and that's also a role that has to play governments as well. And they're not doing it because it's comfortable for them to keep being the ones that take decisions. But the idea is that when you bring more people, more diversity, when you work bottom up, you will get policies, regulation, processes that are more accepted by everyone. And people feel like they've been part of the whole process and they wanted to make the process successful. So these are good examples that come from our community that I think are useful for the IGF as well, and any internet governance forum.
Thank you very much, Amalia. I want to turn to Alex from Google for the kind of the same question, especially because, you know, it is essentially kind of the polar opposite, right? To some extent, you know, the private companies govern in terms of they create facts on the ground, which become then the de facto base from which we're thinking about how to govern things. So what would you say in terms of possible governance strategies that promote inclusion of human rights, and what is the role of the IGF and multi-stakeholderism?
I have so many thoughts based on sort of what all of my colleagues on the panel have said. And so maybe I will answer your question and do a little bit of a top line, which is, so for me in particular, it's about ensuring that at the individual company level or sort of service level, a company has a governance structure for how they think about human rights or how they do governance in a way that is respectful of human rights. Second, at the sort of industry level, right, for services of a kind or technology of a kind, and then also for the broader ecosystem. So that's sort of like 3 buckets where we need to be thinking about what governance looks like. And it might look, I think Alejandro pointed this out in his comment, that it might not all look the same in every space, that it might need to look different depending on what exactly we're talking about, what we're trying to maximize for, and how stakeholders might be able to engage. So from a company perspective, a company having folks that focus on human rights, a commitment to UNGPs, and embedding that across the company so that they are consulting stakeholders and civil society in ways that are meaningful for that company. With respect to the industry, that's also true. So for social media companies or for companies that host mobile ecosystems or cloud companies, et cetera, there are ways that around individual types of technology, we should be thinking about how do we engage stakeholders? And it might look different when you're talking about a social media company versus when you're talking about cloud enterprise companies, and really what does it look like to engage stakeholders around those questions that are primarily focused on enterprise as the first order, but then also those customers have customers who are end users that we should all be thinking about. So, and then lastly, across the ecosystem, of course, we should be thinking about how to be multi-stakeholder, multi-stakeholder and. So anyway, that's a set of buckets. In addition to that, I'm going to stop soon, Courtney. In addition to that, I think Bob talked about sort of all of the governance tools that we have. And I think, once again, as Alejandro pointed out, those tools are going to be relevant in different ways depending on the kinds of issues that we're talking about. And so, regulation is one important way we all need to be thinking about how we kind of manage and govern these issues. There are ways in which companies are interested in legal certainty. There are ways in which governments should be kind of clear about the legality, necessity, and proportionality of what they're regulating about. And it's helpful for all of us to have clarity on that, and we can advocate around it. But then, of course, there are co-regulatory and self-regulatory models that can be useful sometimes, and sometimes they're useful to a point, and then we get to regulation. So I think it's really being clear that all of these models have a place, and we need to kind of mature the conversation for each of the issues as appropriate. I wish there was a one size fits all, but really it's not. It's that we have to sort of articulate each problem that it is that we're trying to solve, and of course be sure that we're involving stakeholders. The last thing I'll say is that governments have a duty to protect human rights. Companies have a responsibility to respect them. And so that requires resources and sort of architecting our engagement in a way that allows other stakeholders from civil society, from academia, et cetera, to participate in conversations with us. And so that means that companies have to invest in and support capacity building for civil society, and governments and the philanthropic sector do as well, because we recognize that it takes a lot of energy and capacity on behalf of all of those individuals and organizations to even engage in a conversation with us about what the issues are, what the impacts of our technology are, and how we can kind of resolve those. So, okay, I'll stop there. But that's a lot of how we're thinking about it.
Thank you so much, Alex. I know there's so much more we could talk about on this issue. And I wish we had time to delve into this idea of like solving problems versus creating the future we want, and how those are, in tension or potentially training along the same lines. But we do not, because we are at the top of the hour. And I do want to note that Alejandro Pisanti left a comment in the chat, which I think is very relevant to what Alex just was speaking about, which is, Alejandro said, let's dispel the notion of one governance system or unit for all issues in the whole world. It's close to the delusion of one global government. a more federated approach may be productive, so that in each case is oriented to solving a specific problem, as Alex framed it, the way, for example, the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, concentration on tech standards, ICANN on the DNS, the domain name system, and IP addresses, and then some other suggestions, which I think is really interesting. And as we wrap up, I did kind of throw out this term polycentrism, which I think has some promise and just starting to delve into by some of the people who are thinking deeply about this issue, specifically in a workshop being conducted by the Kate Hamburger Kohlig Center for Global Cooperation Research. And one of the ideas about polycentrism is that it's a form of governance and policy making that is characterized by diffuse decision points that are transscalar, so it's intertwining local, national, regional, and global scales, and it is transsectoral. It moves between public, private, hybrid, and it foregrounds the relational aspects of governance that are structured through combinations of norms, practices, and underlying orders. And I would posit that multi-stakeholderism is an underlying order, a normative value of governance, internet governance, but it is not the end all be all. This needs to be essentially, the goal in and of itself. And so I think there's a lot of work being done across all stakeholder groups in all these different areas to really think about how we can govern to create a more inclusive, economically beneficial, and human rights respecting internet ecosystem, recognizing that what we mean by the internet has expanded exponentially since it was first defined in the Tunis WSIS agenda, as somebody I think pointed out in the chat, and that a lot of what we need to do here throughout this specific workflow is to really think about how we move forward, building on all of the progress that we've made, recognizing, I think, at a much deeper level, some of the fundamental power dynamic challenges and the differences in ability to participate and benefit from the new environment that we all live in which infuse our daily political, social, and economic lives. And would just like to thank our panelists for this really interesting, robust discussion. Again, this is setting us up for the main session at the Internet Governance Forum. So this conversation will continue. I would like to ask everyone to join me in thanking our panelists, and appreciate you for joining in this conversation today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.